Hi, class. We're moving on to our next topic, which is the art of ancient Greece. So let's get started. All right, so we have another warm-up activity. We're going to look at a work of art that we talked about when we talked about ancient Egyptian art, and then we're going to compare it to something we're going to be talking a little bit more in depth about this week. And I think that is very useful to get a sense of where we're coming from, where we're going, especially with these two cultures because they had a lot of interaction with one another. So you'll see that there are a lot of similarities that are happening as well as some differences because we are also looking at a different time period. This is the two statues we're looking at are about 2,000 years apart in when they were created. So the statue that we're looking at on the right is King Menkaure and his wife or goddess. If you remember, we talked about this during our unit on ancient Egyptian art, and we weren't quite sure, scholars are not quite sure who the female figure is. It could be a wife, could be a deity. But let's talk about some of the material qualities and formal qualities of this that we can compare to our other work. So if you remember, there is a sense of anatomical realism to these figures that we're looking at. You can tell that there's an attention being paid to the human form. If you go all the way back to our prehistoric units, you'll remember that there wasn't really a great understanding yet of how to depict the human body in a sculpture realistically with musculature, with, as if they have bones, right? Like as if it's an actual body. So here we're seeing that this is something that is being there is not only interest but a skill set that's being developed, being able to develop. You have musculature being shown. The face is fairly realistic. You'll notice that we have the arms in particular. To me, the arms really give a very good sense that there's a realism. There's some portions that are still not super realistic. The hands, particularly the female, look pretty stiff. Hands are very hard to carve, and especially the one that is placed on the body of the king is kind of looks placed there, right? It doesn't look super realistic. Symbolically speaking, we have a lot of things that are giving us the sense that we're looking at a pharaoh figure, some sort of important figure. We have the Nemes, we have the pharaonic beard, we have the clothing is telling us that this is somebody in a position of authority. We also have this forward strive, which is giving a symbolism of moving forward into the future, as well as a stoic face, which gives this sense of eternity, which like unchangingness. Now, take a second and see if you can do a little bit of formal analysis of the figure on the left by yourself. Feel free to pause the video. Uh, Look at some of the things that are depicted in this other figure, see if there's any similarities, any differences that you come up with, and see if there's anything any questions that you might have about the figure. So if we're talking about this figure, one of the biggest similarities that you'll notice between the Egyptian statue and the one that we're looking at here is we still have a very distinct interest in a realistic depiction of anatomy, right? Distinct musculature, biceps, pecs, abs, the leg muscles. You can see that there's a sense that they want to have the body look correct, the way that your eyes would perceive a body realistically. You'll notice that we still have a pretty stoic face. This is also going to be important, what we're looking at. One thing that is very similar, because the thing about it is these figures are pretty similar in a lot of ways, right? Is the pose, the posture, right? We have this stride forward, stoic face, the hands clasped on the side, right? Like the fists closed together. So there's clearly interaction going on here. The Greeks were very, very inspired and influenced by Egyptian art in particular, and we're going to see that play out many times. Some of the differences that we'll notice that are important to point out because we will see these again and again is first, you might have noticed we're dealing with a nude figure. That is something that we have not really dealt with a lot with ancient Egyptian art. Unless we were looking at a debasing gesture, trying to maybe embarrass a figure or something like that, right? Um, so the fact that we're seeing a nude figure, specifically a nude figure that is not being debased, is really important. That's going to tell you a lot about a ideological shift happening in the perception and the portrayal of nudity. In ancient Greek art, we will see fairly often male nudity, not as much female nudity. That changes towards the end of the unit that we'll talk about, and we'll talk a little bit more specifically about that. But nudity is certainly going to play a part into the works that we're going to be looking at. The hairstyle, in particular, is also going to play an important part of what we're going to be talking about. You'll notice that we do not have any attributes that give us the sense that this figure is any sort of royalty. So keep that in mind as well. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the last thing I really want to point out that's extremely important is the fact that we're looking at a freestanding sculpture. All right, that might not seem like it's a big deal, but that's actually a huge deal. The fact is that this sculpture is designed to be able to stand up on its own. That is extremely difficult to do with these hard materials unless you have a perfect sense of how to distribute weight. Okay, that's a very difficult thing to do. You'll notice that King Benkari and his wife are on a matrix, which, you see kind of this block of stone in the back that it's the whole thing was carved and that was left there to offer as a support. This other one we have, no support. That's very difficult to do. Big deal. We'll talk more about it. All right, we're going to locate ourselves geographically, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the history of ancient Greece, and that's going to locate us in time and space as to what we're going to be discussing when we talk about art of ancient Greece. So, this map, I chose this map because I really want us to think about the last couple of weeks. We focus on ancient Mesopotamia, right? This is this big green area in particular, particularly like the dark green area, but really extended far beyond that. Then we moved on to the art of ancient Egypt, which you'll notice is more towards the bottom, middle, leftish. That's the Egyptian kingdom. But this week we're going to be focusing on the Greek city-states, which is all the way up to the left, over here by the north of the Mediterranean Sea, right? So I wanted us to think, I want you to always be thinking geographically, because one of the things, like I mentioned, is ancient Egypt did play a big part in influencing the art of ancient Greece as well as ancient Mesopotamia. And that's because geographically speaking, they're fairly close to one another, right? And they're trading, they're talking, there's wars happening between these areas. So there's inevitably going to be some overlap in the things that we're looking at, as well as distinct differences as well, right? All right, so when we talk about ancient Greece, the Greeks, this larger area was really they refer to themselves as Hellenists. So you're going to hear that term a couple times, and so that's going to give you a sense of where that comes from. But really, when we're talking about ancient Greece, there wasn't this Greek it wasn't like it was the nation of Greece, right? It was really several independent city-states that were existing simultaneously, often warring with one another, but sometimes working together to fight invaders and enemies, but located around this area by the Aegean Sea, again, north of the Mediterranean. So the city-states were, again, largely independent. A lot of times they fought with one another, but they were united by a common language and common religion. And again, they sometimes would unite in order to be able to have more power against competing nations. There were trade routes that existed between the Greeks as well as other places like the Egyptians, the Persians, and the Syrians. Again, this is this Mesopotamian area as well as ancient Egypt. And they openly acknowledged the fact that they borrowed ideas, motifs, conventions, and skills from their Mediterranean neighbors. So a lot of, again, what we're looking at is going to be influenced by what we're talking about, or what we have been talking about the last couple of weeks. Athens is often considered the intellectual and artistic center. That's really where a lot of the ideas, the texts, the art that we're going to be looking at is coming from. It's not exclusively from Athens, but Athens really considered itself as well as being very focused on the arts, as well as combat and physical strength as also. But they were considered the cultural and kind of intellectual center of Greek life. A lot of very famous philosophers, architects, and artists worked in Athens. I mean, you guys would probably know a ton of names, and you might not even realize that they were ancient Greek, or let alone that they were from Athens or that they were operating in Athens. And so it's an important center where a lot of these things are happening. Mathematical formulas used to determine idealized and harmonic proportions were often used. The ancient Greeks were very interested in the study of many different areas of the sciences, math, art. They were interested in progressing and learning new things all the time, and all of those things became incorporated into the different into the different things that they made. So art, for example, while it seems maybe, especially in the last couple units, you might not be thinking like mathematical formulas and things like that. I mean, we did talk about that with ancient Egypt, but before that. But the Greeks were very interested in using the scientific and mathematical formulas that they used in their artworks to make things more realistic. And we'll talk a lot more about that and to be harmonious because again, we'll talk more in depth about this, but the idea of harmony and unity and proportion in art was not just something like, oh, well, that sounds like a fun idea. It actually was more philosophical than that. There was a sense of if we make something geometrically proportional, there's something divine about that. And why would we not? We want our art to be as divine or as perfect as possible. And we'll see some examples of exactly how that manifests. Politics. So, in terms of politics, ancient Greece is often given credit as being the first democratic society. The word democracy comes from a Greek word. So, the idea of direct democracy did begin in ancient Greece with a lot of caveats. So, um, there were still many city-states that had kings, but we do know that there were many Greek city-states that did have a democracy, but that only meant there was a particular class of people. You had to be land-owning white male. You couldn't be foreign, you couldn't be a slave, you couldn't be a woman. There was a lot of exceptions to that rule. It was really about 10 to 15% of the population that could vote. So in the sense that there was more people involved in ruling than like a monarchy. Yes, that's absolutely correct, but it's not like everyone could vote. But that is where democracy begins, as a concept that people can vote and make decisions as a community. So civic order reflected architecture. So that's a big thing that we're going to get into when we talk about our architecture. The last couple units, we've talked about architecture like temples and burial sites, and we've talked about palaces. But this week, we're going to start talking about architecture that is meant for a whole community, and that's a big difference. Just in a perception of the world, right? That grand architecture shouldn't just be for the people in charge, but could also be used by everyday people. That's actually a huge ideological perspectival shift, right? We'll talk more about that. The ideal Greek human was both physically and intellectually disciplined. So that meant again that there is this interest in learning and becoming educated, as well as being physically able to engage in combat and things like that. So both of those things were quite important. And we'll see that manifested in art, right? We're going to see very physically fit figures, as well as a focus on intellectual endeavors as well, which is harder to maybe notice on first glance at looking at a sculpture, but when we get into the details of it, it might become more evident. Male nudity is quite common, female nudity less readily explored, but nudity had this association it had there was this idea connected to it that was fairly new that the human body was itself something to be praised and to be shown as this ideal form. And so that should be praised and elevated in sculpture. And we'll see more examples of that. So women were not considered fully equals in Greek life, so we're not going to see a ton of emphasis on females, the female form, but we'll see some exceptions to that, and we'll talk about it. There were slaves within ancient Greece, so again, keep in mind that a lot of the things we're going to be looking at is really directed. I want to give the sense that we are moving towards art that is more for a public sphere, but we have to keep in mind that there were a lot of caveats to this. So, yes, there's a shift away from a monarchy, a shift away from the pharaoh being the most important person. There is a shift away from that, but yet, I don't want to say that like, oh, all of a sudden everybody's equal and now we're going to see depictions of every type of person. That's just not true. But we'll see how that manifests in some of the art. We have a vast pantheon of gods and goddesses. A lot of people are really interested in Greek and Roman mythology because it's fascinating. There's such cool stories when it comes to Greek and Roman mythology. I mean, there's many amazing mythologies in lots of cultures around the world, but really cool stories. One of the things that's really interesting about Greek mythology in particular, I think it's part of the reason people are so interested in general in Greek mythology is because when you read stories of Greek mythology, so often we see very flawed people dealing with problems, including the deities, including the gods and goddesses, make mistakes, hurt people's feelings, get offended, go to war, have romantic relationships. There's all of these things that they experience, which are very human-like, as opposed to being godlike in a sense that they're untouchable and unrelatable. Really, when you think about Greek gods and goddesses, outside of the, great powers that they hold, they are fairly relatable. They have real problems oftentimes that we can understand as humans. And again, this is going to show us that there's this huge shift being moved away from having these deities that are untouchable far away to being closer to what humans are, which shows a shift in maybe humans are capable and have capacities in a way that wasn't really praised before. I want to give a quick timeline. I'm not really concerned with you knowing like battles and things like that. Really, what I want you to know, when we talk about ancient Greece is I want you to know these three main time periods that often get divided. I mean, we kind of did the same thing with ancient Egypt of dividing um, between different eras. And I really want you to know those eras because they also are used often when we're describing different eras of Greek art. So before 1100 BCE, the Aegeans were occupying most of the Greek islands. So this is sort of like if we're thinking about ancient Egypt, like that pre-dynastic period, right? Before we really have this flourishing civilization. Around 900 BCE is when city-states begin to form and take major power. And then once we get into 600 BCE, this is when we begin the Archaic period. Then we have the Classical period and the Hellenistic period. There are really political events that happen that mostly divide these three eras. But those political events really influence life and how the world is experienced by the Greeks. So that changes the type of art that they're making, right? So in the Archaic period, city-states are still fairly war centered. There's still a lot of infighting between city-states as well as enemies like the Persians, which is in Mesopotamia. And Athens is actually destroyed in 480 BCE, and that is going to be important because we're going to talk about that when we talk about the reconstruction of Athens, because what they reconstruct is very important. Then we're moving on to the classical period. We have the Peloponnesian War, and Alexander the Great unites Greece and Macedonia. And that happens towards the end of it. That really marks the shift into the Hellenistic period. And the Hellenistic period is where Alexander the Great dies and the Greek Empire crumbles. And so this is sort of seen again as like the denouement, like the slope downward for Greek life. I didn't spend a lot, but the classical period is when people think of ancient Greece, the classical period is typically when they're thinking, and it's actually not a very long time, historically speaking, but this is really this proliferation of art, proliferation of literature and philosophy, and all of these ideas become really important. So again, we are dealing with three time periods in ancient Greece. The first being the Archaic period. So let's look at some details that we can distinguish as archaic in nature. So when we talk about the Archaic era in ancient Greek art, when we're talking about sculpture, typically we're going to be looking at grave markers and monuments. That means that other things are not really surviving. One of the things that sometimes happens in something like art history is that because we have cemeteries and monuments and graves left, it seems that there was just like this obsession with death, which ancient Egypt is maybe a little bit of the exception to that. But really, when we talk about ancient Greece, that's really just what survives. That's what we have left. And so those are the things that we're going to be looking at in terms of the content to help us get an idea of what archaic Greek art looks like. Most of what we're seeing is marble. Marble is found quite often in ancient Greece. It just occurs naturally there. So that's going to be very characteristic of ancient Greek art is the vast use of marble, which we did not and have not seen really at all in the last couple of weeks. We do see iron, wood, gold, bronze, terracotta, and limestone, but mostly we're going to be looking at marble. We are going to also see the lost wax process being used for the first time on a large scale. I have a slide on the next slide will give us a little bit more detail into that as to why that's a big deal and what that process really looks like. Sculptures were often painted, which would highlight certain features, especially faces. It's really ironic because in terms of archaeology, whenever people discover these sculptures, because most of the paint has worn off, there's this idea that ancient Greek sculpture was just marble and, didn't have really color or anything to it, which has given the false sense that that's what they all looked like. So there's a lot of artists many hundreds of years later that become influenced by ancient Greece and when they create sculpture, create just plain marble sculptures, when in it trying to base it on ancient Greek sculptures, when in reality that's not what they would have looked like, but they wouldn't have known that because there wouldn't have been archaeological studies on that quite yet. There wasn't, they hadn't done that kind of they hadn't discovered that fact yet. So a lot of what we're looking at is inspired by ancient Egyptian art, which we saw a comparison already that shows us that that's certainly true. Often we're seeing front-facing figures, sometimes in mid-stride. Often we're seeing figures that are being cut free of a stone matrix, which again, this is this freestanding sculpture idea, big shift that we're seeing. And often in archaic sculpture, we're seeing this, what's known as an archaic smile, which is interesting because it seems like, okay, well, why is the smile a big deal? Well, everything we've looked at so far, if you remember, we haven't seen a lot of, we've really only seen um, figures fairly emotionless. When we're talking about ancient Egypt, we get the sense that there was symbolism behind that. But also, when you think about the attempt to depict a human person, most humans are not just stoic all the time, right? They're not just having a flat face. You have emotions, right? You laugh, you smile, you frown, you do lots of different things. So the introduction of this archaic smile in ancient Greek art, a lot of art historians have said that that's actually a fairly big innovation because it's the introduction of really personal emotion and this idea of almost like a personal experience into these sculptures. So we'll see a lot of examples of that. And some of the sculptures we're going to be looking at would have originally had accessories, maybe like harps, spears, things like that, often giving you a sense of who you're looking at. But most of those would be lost now. So sometimes we can tell when there's a sculpture that looks like it would have been holding something and that has been, is gone now. So we'll see that. All right, so this picture, I wanted to talk quickly about the lost wax process. This is extremely important. This is a very big innovation that took place that the ancient Greeks used quite often when they were doing metal sculpture, or really creating anything out of metal, because you can also create a lot of utilitarian things out of metal too, right? Like weapons or tools of that nature. All right, so the lost wax process is pretty straightforward, but very genius in my opinion. I think it's like really cool that somebody came up with that at some point. You take wax, mostly beeswax would have been used by the ancient Greeks, and they would have molded whatever shape that they want their final product to look like. They'll shape it in whatever shape that they want. And then what you do is you take clay, like ceramic clay, like what you would use to make ceramics. You would put clay around this wax, and then you would heat it up, and you would, like you do in a kiln nowadays, you create your pottery, and then through that process, it dries out, right? And it becomes very hard. The clay does, but the wax actually melts, and there's normally like a hole at the bottom to let the wax melt out and leave, and then it leaves this cavity in place that could be filled with metal, molten metal, which is melted down metal, poured into this mold, and then you can break the pottery around it, the clay around it, after it's been um, heated up, and then you have your object that you made out of metal. So it's a pretty genius invention, in my opinion. So our first major work that we're looking at is something that technically we've already seen. We looked at this with our warm-up activity. This is the Anavisos Koros. When we are referring to this title, Anavisos references where this was found approximately. The Kuros is a reference, the word Kuros just means youth, and this is really a designation of a type of sculpture that was found quite often in ancient Greece, which is a male youth sculpture. Um, Again, we have lots of examples of this, and they mostly look like this. You can go online, look at some more examples to give you an idea of what other Kuros figures looks like. Whenever we're looking at these Kuros figures, we're looking at young male warrior figures. We know that we're looking at young male warrior figures because we have the warrior attributes of the idealized musculature and form of the figure. We actually have an engraving here that also gives us a sense of who we're looking at. But we know that we have a type of soldier being depicted here. This is meant to mark a grave, potentially an athlete or a warrior, perhaps somebody who did die in battle. These were also used possibly to be offerings to gods or intended to represent gods potentially too. Again, we're not quite sure, but we do have a sense because where these were found were often near temple sites or near grave sites. So, it gives us a sense. There is an inscription to this figure that reads, "Stay and mourn at the monument of dead Croesus, who raging Ares slew as he fought in the front ranks." So most people have interpreted this that this must mean that we're looking at a depiction of a soldier, or at least a sculpture honoring a soldier, a warrior who died in battle, which was really the most heroic way to go for the ancient Greeks. This is a very common motif in the literature. If you read the Iliad, the Odyssey, this is quite a noble cause to die in battle. The pose is very reminiscent of ancient Egyptian pose, like the King Menkari figure that we were looking at. We see quite often this figure of this idealized form with the hands at the side, quite this rigid posture, striding forward. The fact that we're using marble again is because we're in Greece and this was a common material found, but there was also because we have this lost wax process, there is an ability to make more tools, which help make harder stones, like to carve harder stones like marble possible. Again, rigid frontal pose. And we do have this archaic smile, again, introducing a more lifelike quality. This figure is not probably this faraway being, right? This is a person, a representation of a warrior figure. And even if it is a god, the gods were never represented to be, completely separate from humans, but fairly close to what humans look like as well. You have this knotted hairstyle that we see that looks actually quite similar to what was seen in ancient Mesopotamia. So we do believe that there probably was an influence from ancient Mesopotamia as well, which makes perfect sense because there's lots of trading happening and wars and interaction between these cultures. And we do have remnants of paint that are evident on this piece. You probably wouldn't see it on the body, but if you do look at the hair, you'll notice there's like a red tinge to it. That's because there was red paint. This picture I have here, sorry, my camera gave out, but quickly, this picture I have here at the bottom is an image of Gilgamesh, who is an ancient Mesopotamian king who was portrayed in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and this is a depiction of him, and you'll notice that the hairstyle is quite similar. All right, here's another great comparison that's going to help us to understand archaic statuary a little bit more, archaic sculpture. So when we're looking at the right, we're looking at our Kuros figure again. We've seen him a couple times at this point, and here on the left, we're going to be looking at a female version of the same type of statuary, which is known as a Kori. So Kori is just a female youth, Koros, male youth. Got it? That's the distinction. So when we're looking at these figures, again, lots of similarities, right? We have this upright figure, we have this archaic smile, we have this interest in this braided hairstyle. Um, we'll talk more about the context that also will be a little bit similar to what we're talking about with the Kuros. But let's look at some differences, particularly just in the formal elements. You'll notice that one of the big things I keep emphasizing with the Kuros is this really distinct interest in anatomy, right? And this idealized form, this warrior form. However, we're looking at the female figure. Remember, I mentioned that nudity was not as much seen in female forms, at least not for a while when we're talking about ancient Greek statues. And this is a great example of that. Clearly, we have a figure that has a dress on, a peplos actually, which we'll talk more about in a second. But one of the things that is important to point out about that is the depiction of the clothes. There's not a ton of detail in it, right? It's not really meant, there's not this interest in drapery and how the cloth falls. It's pretty square, it's pretty rounded in a very basic way. There's not a lot of attempt to show the form underneath the clothing, right? Because there's not really as much of an interest in the realistic depiction of the female form as there is in the depiction of the male form. We do have the distinction between a female body and a male body because we have breasts that are being shown underneath the peplos shawl that we see on the left. But again, there's clearly a distinction in the perception of the female versus male form and the attempts made at anatomy within those forms. So we're looking at this peplos chori. The peplos is a reference to the dress that this figure is wearing. And again, the chori just means female youth, which is a designation similar to the choros for the male youth. We're looking at, again, something that would have been used as a grave marker. However, this one in particular was found buried beneath the Acropolis. So the Acropolis is an important location in Athens that we'll talk a lot more about later. But it was buried in three pieces, and some scholars believe that this might have been damaged during a Persian siege, during the Persian siege of Athens, and then possibly buried underneath the one of the temples in order to be rebuilt later or to protect it essentially that it wouldn't be debased or destroyed by the enemies. The left arm is clearly missing, but there is a socket there, which lets us know that this would have been designed in separate pieces. And it is believed that this arm would have projected forward, potentially holding something. That is something that we have seen. And, if you go through the trouble of making this whole separate piece, it's probably because it's holding something. There's something about the arm that's significant. And it's possible that that would have been something that would have been an attribute telling us who this figure is. If it was a bow, it might have indicated Artemis, the Greek goddess Artemis. If it was an apple, it could have been an indication that it's Aphrodite. She's wearing a peplo shawl, which again, that's what she's wearing, and that gives us the name for this figure. We see the waist is cinched in, but we don't see again a ton of detail in what we're looking at. We do see a slight indication that it's a female form because of the breasts, but we don't see really a focus on the anatomy. The face is rounded with naturalistic features and again, an archaic smile, this attempt to be lifelike, to give personality or a life to this figure. The knotted hair is very similar to the figure, the Koros that we looked at before. And again, we know that this would have been painted because we have this, the remnants in the hair. You can see there's this redness to it that lets us know that this would have been painted at one part. And I included a picture here to give us this is just a guess. This is an artist's reconstruction of the statue with full painting to give us an idea of maybe what it would have looked like, which gives a completely different sense than just having the unpainted sculpture. So we really have to keep in mind that even our experience of it is going to be very limited because we're missing what this would have looked like originally. So we're going to be moving on from talking about archaic sculpture into archaic period trends of architecture. Remember, we're going to be talking about archaic, classical, and Hellenistic art, and we're going to make distinctions between those three. And architecture is going to be an important one because we're going to see a distinct archaic style of architecture, a classical style of architecture, and a uh, Hellenistic style of architecture, and they'll sort of build on each other. So let's get some details about that. So as far as archaic architecture goes, we don't have a ton of surviving archaic architecture. Mostly we have ruins of architecture, but we do have texts about architecture, which is going to be extremely important because text is going to offer us details about this type of architecture, and it's going to still become very influential on later styles. So what we do know comes from, again, foundations, ruins mostly, and then some text about the architecture from contemporaries, so from Greek uh, writers at the time that this architecture would have existed. So a lot of the early architecture, archaic architecture is going to be temples dedicated to Greek gods. A lot of this architecture is also going to be ephemeral, meaning that we're using material or they were using materials like terracotta, mud brick, thatch, and wood. That's going to give you an indication as to why a lot of that doesn't exist because every single one of those mediums are fairly they don't last a long time. So it's something that, necessarily is not going to stand the test of time. Whereas later, when more marble and stone becomes incorporated, that is able to last for a really long time. So that's why we have more of that surviving. Yeah, exactly. So permanent materials like stone become more common later. There are some examples in the archaic period, and typically, if we do see the use of stone, it's only going to be for something like a temple, like a very important architectural structure. When we talk about the archaic period, again, we have archaic, classical, Hellenistic. There's three different type of temple structures we're going to talk about too. So in the archaic period, we're going to be seeing the Doric order. Okay, so Doric order is going to be attached to the archaic period. Classical, we're going to see what's called the Ionic order. And then the Hellenistic period, we're going to see what's called the Corinthian order. And we'll see what those other two look like. But the Doric order is a style of temple that, again, is associated with the archaic period. And the way to identify a Doric order temple is going to be when you see this image here, that's going to give you a good idea of what a Doric temple looks like, a Doric order temple. You're going to have columns that have unadorned capitals. So capitals is basically what the top of the column looks like. When we get to the other periods like Ionic and Corinthian, they're going to be far more decorated and sculpted, and we'll see exactly what that looks like. In the Doric order, you're also going to see usually pretty decorated friezes. So frieze is this area at the top where you see these like small sculptural elements. And then also, sorry, going back to the column, you're gonna have a baseless column, meaning that the base is just gonna go directly onto the ground of the temple, as opposed to having some sort of, again, like another adornment or something in between the base, like the ground or the floor of the temple and the bottom of the column. So you have simple columns, don't have bases, unadorned architraves. So an architrave is basically the area right above the column, but then above that you have the frieze, and typically those are decorated with alternating patterns between the triglyphs. You don't need to know this, but the triglyphs are those like little triple lines, and then you have the sculpted elements in between that. So our first work of architecture we're going to discuss is the Agora in Athens. Now, this area of Athens was eventually destroyed in about 480 BCE. That's when the Persians sacked Athens, destroyed it, and then it was not long after rebuilt. So when we talk about the Agora, it's we based on text, again, based on text and some ruins, we know what the agora looked like, but it was eventually rebuilt. So what exists there today is not what originally would have existed, okay? But the reason we have to talk about the agora is because it's actually a really big innovation in the type of architecture that is being produced in these major civilizations. Now, the thing about the agora is the agora is considered a city center. It's a public area where people from all over Athens could gather together, and it was a public space. So there was commercial endeavors here. So people were selling and buying things here. There are political centers here, and we'll talk more specifically about that in a minute, but places where people would conduct political meetings. There were temples, which were to be used by public, the general public. And all of this is really important to acknowledge in the history of the type of architecture we've been talking about, because if you go back to the last couple of weeks, what kind of architecture we've been looking at? We've been looking at temples, we've been looking at burial sites, we've been looking at palaces. All of those sites are for whom to be used by. They are used by royalty, to connect to the deities, right? They're places for wealthy people, places that not a lot of people could go into, or where you bury somebody, right? Like none of these things are really meant for public use. So the fact that we're shifting to this mindset that architecture can exist for the public good is a really big deal. That's really important to acknowledge that this is really the beginning of when we're seeing that. So as far as the Agora, again, the Agora is going to be composed of several architectural spaces. So it's not like one structure, it's all these different buildings in this public area. And again, what exists today is not what would have originally been built, which originally would have been done after an archaic model. But then as it was rebuilt, there were classical buildings built and then Hellenistic buildings built. However, the general idea of having this public space originated all the way back to when archaic architecture was really the major style. So again, served several functions, commercial, civic, religious. Also, we have government buildings and also religious centers. And you'll notice that we have a Panathenaic way that goes right between or like right through the middle of the agora. And that's because we have this path that directs people that if you're on the path to go directly onto the Acropolis, and then the Acropolis is on a hill, and at the very top of the Acropolis you have the Parthenon, which is the major temple in Athens dedicated to Athena, Athena being the patron deity of Athens. That's where Athens gets its name, obviously. So, you know, we have this connection directly to this public space where kind of more secular things are happening to this higher ground where deity, you're honoring deity there, right? So this is an important connection between those two areas. We're going to talk a lot about the Parthenon when we get to classical architecture, but know that this is in the same area, okay? So yes, again, this path was not only to direct you to where the temple was, but was also used in celebrations and rituals where you would bring offerings and the entire community would participate. This was not something that was just for, you know, the priests or just for the kings or the whoever, right? Like this is a democratic society, so generally this would have incorporated more people. So again, the structure that we see here would also be to support democracy. We're not seeing a palace here. We're not seeing a place where the king lives. We're not seeing these grand temples dedicated to one person and burying them. This is meant to be more public. There's more, the areas are meant to encompass more people and to be more inclusive. Again, with the caveat that you had to be, you know, a landholding male. So it's not like everyone was included, but it was broader than it had been historically. So yes, at the base of the Acropolis, we've talked about that, eventually destroyed by the Persians, and we'll talk about that rebuilding. But there were temples. We have this Panathenaic Way. We have a Bouleuterion. We'll see a picture of that in a minute. This was a chamber used by council citizens. So that means that this was this democratic space, a space that people could meet together. Also a Tholos. A Tholos was a place where senators could hold emergency meetings. Again, a political place for more than just, you know, one leader. It was for the democratic approach that they had, as well as a stoa, which was a covered walkway with columns on one side and a wall on the other. And this is again a really huge public space. You'll notice I have each of these words highlighted in a particular color. And then if you look at this map, that highlighted color should align with um the architecture so you can kind of see where they are. You'll notice the stoa is really long and we have several of them. Tholos is small for senators. The Bouleuterion a little bit bigger. It's more like a theater kind of setup. So let's look at some more pictures. Here's some photos to help you get a sense of what the Agora would have looked like, specifically what some of these buildings would have looked like in the Agora. All of these things were either well, were destroyed and then rebuilt to look slightly differently. So not a good comparison, or just don't exist anymore because they would have been destroyed even later. But these are a couple of photos just to give you a sense of what these buildings would have looked like. So this Bouleuterion on the left, this is again not the Athenian one, and the Tholos that we see on the right, this is not the Athenian one, but this is to give you a sense of what those buildings might have looked like these reconstructions. So the Bouleuterion, almost like a theater structure, would have been used for political gatherings. Tholos, again, also We have this, another political structure. And you'll notice here that we have evidence of the archaic architecture. We have these simple columns with unadorned capitals, no base on the column, just goes directly into the floor. And then the stoa is, again, using the same archaic style. Those don't exist anymore. The stoas as they would have looked during the archaic period, but this just gives you a sense of what they could have looked like. Here's another map to show you. We have the Panathenaic Way, we have the Stoas, the Boletarian, the Tholos. Again, take some time to look at this. You don't have to know like the specifics of these things, but really the major idea I want you to know is this idea that we're moving into these public spaces, something that is meant to encompass more people. That really tells you a lot about the society itself. And here's another image just to give you a sense of where that Panathenaic Way leads through the Agora into the Acropolis. Right, now we're going to be moving on to classical art and architecture. So here's a little bit of an activity that's going to give you some insight into the distinctions, the changes that are going to start to take place. So on the left-hand side, you'll notice I have three figures that are all Kouros figures. We've talked about the Kouros figures. You'll notice that a lot of them are fairly similar, right? And I want you to do a comparison between these Kouros figures to Doryphorus, which is this figure that I have more towards the right. So pause video, take a minute, notice the differences, the similarities. Let's think about why those changes have taken place. How are those changes being shown? Is it, through technical skill? Is it shown through the figure, right? Think about all of those questions and we'll talk about it. So you might notice that on the left, the Kouros figures, again, look very similar. We have this rigid pose. We do have an interest in the uh, accurate depiction of anatomy. We have the foot forward stride. The archaic smile is being incorporated. We have this longer hairstyle. So let's move on to Doryphorus. Now, most people, when they make a comparison between these two, if you ask them which one is more anatomically correct, you're probably going to say Doryphorus, right? And why is that? Because we see more musculature being outlined, we see veins that are being outlined, we see more detail in the actual anatomy, we see more folds in the skin that give a sense of reality. But one of the biggest differences you're going to notice is not just in the technical skill of the way that the body is being depicted from like a surface level, but something else, and that is actually the pose of the figure. Now, if you look at the figures on the left and compare the posture, the pose, between the Kouros and the Doryphorus, what will you notice? The Doryphorus gives a more of a sense of lifelikeness, right? That's because he has a shape that's known as a contrapposto shape. Contrapposto shape is when we take, on the left, again, we have this very rigid structure, this rigid line. And then Doryphorus, he has just this slight tilt in his hips, right? His knee is bent. He has his weight more onto one side than the other, right? And that's why his knee is bent. And what does that do? That immediately makes it look more lifelike, right? I mean, how many people do you know when they're standing are completely straight up? I mean, yes, we have people with very good posture or military or whatever, right? Like there's reasons to stand like that. But most people in real life don't naturally make a pose like that, right? They're going to tend to put, one weight on one side. You're going to have your arms moving, right? Most people have a little bit more movement and direction in their body as opposed to just like a rigid structure with your body, right? So let's get more into why that is the case and where that comes from. Oh, sorry, I'm missing the second part of the thing, but anyways. All right, so again, we have the introduction of contrapposto. That is very quickly going to turn into a lot of other really innovative poses and really difficult things to portray. You'll notice on the very top here, we have this sculpture of someone doing something very athletic, and we're going to talk more about that sculpture later. But again, we're moving into these depictions of the human body that are not as rigid. We have more of a twist, more of a bend, fluidity, dynamism, more naturalistic. We also will see a lot more freestanding sculptures, which we did see with the Koros, and that is a very difficult thing to pull off. And a lot of times, again, you look at this Discobolus on the top, you see the figure that's doing this athletic pose. There is a support in the back because that's really, really hard to pull off in a sculpture without any support. We do start to see the beginning of some female nudity, but typically, if we see female nudity, it's going to be through wet drapery. So, wet drapery is anytime you see a figure covered in some sort of fabric, but it gives the sense that it's wet, and you can tell wet fabric, right? Because it clings to the body and it has this like quality to it. And you'll see this picture here that gives you a sense of what that looks like. So, technically, the women weren't naked, but clearly you can still see the body. So this was sort of like a way to get around the rule, right? I mean, but clearly there's still nudity being depicted here. So when we talk about early and high classical, so scholars have made these very distinct differences between even early and high classical sculpture to late classical. I'm not going to worry about having you guys make those distinctions, but I do want you to know that even within the classical period, there's even a progression there. In the early and high classical period, we have a canonization of human proportions. This happens through some writings, particularly a sculptor named Polyclitus does he writes down he basically is the person that writes down like a typical sculpture is going to be composed of these many elements. And one of the things he describes is that the ideal human is about 7 heads tall, which is still sort of vague, but you'll get the sense when we look at some of these sculptures of what that means. Typically, we're going to see very idealized, heroic bodies. We're going to be seeing athletic figures. We talked about this before, but in Greek life, intellectual fitness as well as physical fitness were both equally prized. So it was important to be physically and mentally fit. So you're going to see that manifest in these works. That typically they're going to be athletic bodies. People and gods are sculpted more realistic as time progresses. So when we get into the late classical period, we're going to see things more human. We're going to start to see imperfections introduced, and we'll see a little bit more about that. A lot of scholars argue it's because there's a lot of political upheaval going on at the time, and we can get more into that when we get kind of into the transition to the Hellenistic period. But let's look at some examples. So here is our example of classical Greek sculpture. This is the Doryphorus sculpture that we looked at a couple slides ago. Remember, we have these really important classical aspects of sculpture like the contrapposto pose. We have the athletic body. We have a focus on anatomy in a way that is meant to look very naturalistic. I have some more details that we can look at. Now, this particular copy that we're looking at, there's actually several versions of this that come from Rome because Rome was very interested in Greek art and architecture. And a lot of art and architecture from Greece doesn't survive but on its own, but survives through Roman copy. So this is actually a Roman copy in marble of an original in Greek. It originally probably would have been cast in bronze, and then was made into several Roman copies because it was seen as such a important, think about like any famous painting that exists today. People are going to want to copy it and, use that as an example to show good work, right? So this would have been something seen as like, oh wow, this is this like amazing work that we need to copy and make sure we have more copies of for other people to see. This is the most complete copy left that we have, and it was originally found in a gymnasium Pompeii. So that tells us that this would have been something that was possibly used to inspire athletes. Again, this is not just something as like here's your gym photo to give you like motivation. But physical fitness was seen connected to your spiritual life and your intellectual life. So, this was meant to be not only a example of what what a good athlete could look like, but through mental fitness as well, right? So we have this closed, firm stance, contrapposto, this really cool balance. And that's the thing about classical architecture that gets talked about a lot is these sort of juxtapositions that turn into something perfect. So we have this body that is this mixture of closed like not, I shouldn't say closed, but flexed muscles and relaxed muscles, right? We have this movement, but he still looks relaxed. He has this stoic face, but he doesn't look off-putting, right? It's sort of this mixture of things to create this perfect person or this perfect depiction of a body. We do have areas where the body is being supported because, again, would be really hard to pull off without support. So we have this support in the back that looks like maybe like a tree stump or something. You'll notice the hand on one side is attached to the body to help give it support in the foot as well. This was all to make sure that it wouldn't break or to reduce the chance of breaking. This also embodies Polyclitus's ideal of 7 human heads. I actually have like these little circles to give you a sense of what that would look like. So it's these 7 heads, and that would be this perfect proportions or symmetria. This is a concept that was extremely important for Greek art and architecture, and I actually have a video of it that can describes it in a minute that we're going to look at. We also believe that this would have originally held a spear or possibly a shield as well. Those don't survive, so we're not quite sure. So this is a fantastic video that I want you guys to watch that is it's this old Disney film. Donald Duck is like the main character, and he's in mathematic land learning about mathematical principles. And here he learns about the golden mean. So the golden mean or the golden ratio is a concept that scholars aren't exactly sure when it started. Some believe it goes back as far as Mesopotamia, possibly evidence of it in ancient Egypt. However, we do know that the Greeks would have been the first to write about it that survives today. So we know Pythagoras, if you guys heard like the Pythagorean theorem. Pythagoras is extremely important in terms of math as to writing down mathematical principles that, still hold true and are still considered extremely important today. So the golden mean was believed to be this naturally occurring structure that exists that shows perfect proportion. The video does a better job of explaining it than I could because I'm not a math person, but it does a really good job of showing how this golden mean as a mathematical principle from the perception of the Greeks could be applied to aesthetic beauty. The implication is that they believed that something that was perfectly mathematically proportional would be inherently beautiful, that the human eye would see that proportion and basically subconsciously understand it as being perfect or beautiful because it fulfills that like perfect geometry. Okay, so the video does a great job of explaining that.
It was our old friend Pythagoras who discovered that the pentagram was full of mathemagic. The two shorter lines combined exactly equal the third. And this line shows the magic proportions of the famous golden section. The second and third lines exactly equal the fourth. Once again, we have the golden section. But this is only the beginning. Hidden within the pentagram is a secret for creating a golden rectangle, which the Greeks admired for its beautiful proportions and magic qualities. The star contains the golden rectangle many times over. It's a most remarkable shape. It can mathematically reproduce itself indefinitely. All these rectangles have exactly the same proportions. This figure also contains a magic spiral that repeats the proportions of the golden section into infinity. To the Greeks, the golden rectangle represented a mathematical law of beauty. we find it in their classical architecture. The Parthenon, perhaps one of the most famous of early Greek buildings, contains many golden rectangles. These same golden proportions are also found in their sculpture. In the centuries that followed, the golden rectangle dominated the idea of beauty in architecture throughout the Western world. The Cathedral of Notre Dame is an outstanding example. The Renaissance painters knew this secret well. Today, the golden rectangle is very much a part of our modern world. Modern painters have rediscovered the magic of these proportions. Indeed, this ideal proportion is to be found in life itself.
Boy, oh boy, oh boy. This is mathematics. I got mathematical figures like that.
Donald.
Get me to it.
No.
Ideal proportion.
Not quite. No, I'm afraid not. Well, we can't all be mathematically perfect.
Oh, yeah? Yeah, I knew I could do it.
Now that you're all pent up in a pentagon, let's see how nature uses this same mathematical form. The petunia. The star jasmine. The starfish. The wax flower. There are literally thousands of members in good standing in nature's Pythagorean Society of the Star. All nature's works have a mathematical logic, and her patterns are limitless. The magic proportions of the golden section are often found in the spirals of nature's designs. The profusion of mathematical forms brings to mind the words of Pythagoras. Everything is arranged according to number and mathematical shape. Yes, there is mathematics in music, in art, in just about everything. And as the Greeks had guessed, the rules are always the same.